All right. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, whoever you are. Thank you for joining us again. Bourbon and Bible Stories. My name is Donte Milligan, minister, theologian, teacher, and I'm with.
I'm Amy McMinn. I am some of those things, not all of those things. I'm an educator, traveler, and a critic, and a questioner.
Yes, good. That's a good way to put it. And again, this is Bourbon and Bible Stories. It's a podcast where we have a drink in a laid back environment and we talk about the Bible. And we ask questions, things that you may be uncomfortable asking in other settings. We try to make this a space where that's okay. So we're going to jump into a passage that I actually think is really interesting and that actually has a lot of meaning for me, even though it's not always the most it's probably not the most famous text. But I guess before we jump in, how's your week been, Amy?
I'm laughing because it's like, teachers know that like the months of January and February are just like
Brutal,
it's
brutal.
it just it's I have no words. Like it is what it is. It's fine. I remember
Yeah.
last week I said the line, I was like, they find no way to like surprise to disappoint me. Um
Hmm.
it's they didn't disappoint me today. Their just behavior didn't surprise me.
I don't know if that's good or bad.
So one of those, but ups and downs, ups and downs.
Hmm.
I started even thinking about the week. Wednesdays are supposed to be my like, not even supposed to be, but like it's the days when I have the least amount of classes.
Hmm.
So I always go into Wednesdays thinking, oh, it's my chill day.
Yeah.
But it always turns out that like the chill days, it's like, oh, that's when all of the meetings happen. And it's like, no,
Yeah.
you're
Yeah.
free, Amy. So then that's like, um so that's kind of been my day, my week-ish. How about you? Oh, we even had a 4-day weekend. That didn't even cross my mind.
Yeah. I was gonna say my week hasn't been bad because today was literally the first day.
Oh
So
my God, that's right.
yeah. So Monday we were off.
Yeah.
Tuesday I was off because my daughter has some sort of virus or stomach bug or whatever. And then yes, today was the first day, and like I didn't have lead onward, so I didn't have to teach. I only had I think one meeting, which is nice. I only have like a one meeting day, and then I did chapel today, which is always fun. So yeah, it was actually like a decent day,
You had a good start
surprisingly.
to your week this Wednesday.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
I
like
will say
now I know tomorrow's gonna be crazy.
I would like to take a minute to give some praise to your chapel session though. Um I mean, I one of the reasons, for anyone listening, especially like, talking about the Bible and religion really is not my thing. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is because of how much I loved listening to you preach in chapel. Like my
Thank
first year.
you.
And I mean that wholeheartedly. Like it gets me hyped.
Yeah. Good,
Or,
good.
or it's like this is the interpretation I've always wanted to better understand.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that I've just never been exposed to. But I really appreciated your talk today, and it was actually, well, I say I'm reflecting now in the moment. I took a class where I learned about Absalom Jones.
Oh, nice.
Uh,
Nice. That's awesome.
yeah, so like I was really excited. I was like, oh my gosh, I know who this is,
Hmm. Hmm.
and he's such a cool figure.
Yeah.
And
He's local too, so that's what's so cool about it.
and granted, I mean, I know our listeners are all over, but I'm in little Burlington, New Jersey. Um,
Yeah.
Not just a little further out, but comes to work in little Burlington. But
Yeah.
even in little old Burlington, there's an African
Yeah, the Amy
Methodist
Church.
Episcopalian. Is that AME
Yep.
um,
Yeah.
church? Like literally right next to me. Um,
Yeah.
and I always like want like I think of this history, and I know it's so local. Um,
Hmm.
but I never have the energy to ask because I'm usually just so tired. I, I
Yeah.
I would really love like it's he's an interesting guy. And I loved your chapel today. I loved um Donte encourages, and I get, you were talking about like Black church was part of the purpose.
Yeah, yeah.
Black History Month, talking about Black church. Um, and I love the idea of church being more energetic.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, like, my experience of church is just very Episcopalian and just not that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I appreciated you trying to bring that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think the energy was there. Uh,
Yeah,
like, and even just like turn and talk to your neighbor and ask some
yeah,
questions and just say these things. Like, it
yeah.
brings energy up, and it
It
makes
does, it does. And it was some of it was comedic for me where I was like, let's see how this works. And it was funny because I remember the first time, like when I said it the first time, turn to your neighbor and repeat after me. It was like a little quiet, and like you could tell the kids are like, "Are we really doing this?" And then when
and
I
you're
was
like,
like,
yeah,
it was like, turn to your other neighbor and say, and it was just like, okay, but
it was like the kid that turned to me to like say it the first time. He was just like, reform, like just like mumbling under his breath, and
yeah,
I was like, I can't hear you. I can't
yeah,
hear
yeah, yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. Say it proud, say it loud.
But yeah, no,
It-
I always love listening to you do chapel, whatever we call it at school.
yeah,
Uh
those
it
those moments are cool too because like in front of me were like a few of the black students that we know well, and there's always moments where like I catch eyes with them and they're like they like you can tell they're really engaged and they're like like yes, this is the tradition that I know. So like even like I think at one point one of the students, I'll say his name off air, but was like yes Lord, or like so like he like
oh,
said something
I
out
know
loud.
who
Yeah, yeah,
he
yeah.
was in my pew. I know who you're talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. And I like
Yeah.
laughed. I was
It was
like,
like,
oh, that's great.
yeah, but do it more.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like, we can do it. We can do whatever we want
Hmm.
here. Like, it's our
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's us. It's for us. So make it what we want to make it. But no, it was good. So yeah, not a bad start to the week.
yeah, and obviously don't need to get into too much. I started with a 7:45 parent conference.
Oh God, yo, morning meetings, but morning parent meetings are the worst because it can just ruin your day before it even started. Like,
And I had never met this one before, so like, just only emails, like, wild card. Don't know what
mhm,
to get, but it did go well. It went well.
that's good.
Like honestly, the vast majority of these parents are fine. Actually,
Yeah.
I had a child apologize for his dad at one point today. She's like,
Oh,
"Oh, sweet baby." Like, no,
it's not your fault.
your parent loves you, and your parent wants your best education, and
Yeah.
you do not need to apologize, sweet baby.
Yeah, yeah, you'll be okay. You'll be okay. It's all right. I can handle
Yeah, exactly.
it.
Well, you want to transition into this story?
Yeah, yeah. Let's jump in.
Okay,
Speaking of,
so
liberation stuff.
I'll say, so for listeners today, Donte and I ran into each other walking into the chapel,
Yeah,
and so just a little context of me getting into the story. Donte, said like I'm excited about our chat later. I told him I haven't fucking started.
yeah.
So sorry, can't help with any leading excitement there. But
Mhm.
Dante said, well, and when he sent me the verses to read, so we're reading Luke 16 to 30.
Luke 4:16-30.
Oh,
Yeah,
4:16-30. Yes.
yeah.
Excuse me. Forgot a number there.
Well, I was just gonna say, if you're in Luke 16, we're in a way different story.
Yeah, I definitely read the right one though, because
All
when I
right.
read this, I was like, I can see why Dante likes this. Uh,
Yeah.
but Dante basically said to me like, oh, like, that you might not have heard the story and it doesn't seem like the most like
Hmm.
exciting story.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I will say, when I read it, so okay, so the story, Jesus in synagogue at Nazareth is
Hmm.
the heading in my King James version for this.
Okay. That's right.
um
That's accurate.
so and I will say, I do think I have heard this story, but it's another one
Okay.
that like I think I've heard it, but definitely never thought about any meaning behind it or anything. Like this,
Yeah.
it sounded familiar of like, oh, Jesus goes to the synagogue and learns. I mean, I guess he's known. He's like a word of the Lord.
Yeah.
He
The
like he
anointed. Yeah.
but this is, I guess, part of that greater narrative.
Hmm. To some
And
extent, yeah.
okay, so if I'm retelling, what I took away from this, he goes to the temple on the
Hmm.
Sabbath,
Hmm.
as the good Jew that he is.
Hmm.
I will say, side note, not the most important question, but there are a lot of Jewish questions that I genuinely do not understand. And
Hmm.
one of the ones is like standing up. Okay, so he went into the Sabbath and he stood up to read, and it seems like he's just standing and reading and praying all day.
Hmm. Kind of.
So that's, to each their own. Uh, and he opens up the, I guess, the scripture.
Hmm.
That's book. And like Dante, I feel like this is a really offensive thing that came to my mind when I was reading this, but like it immediately made me think of Harry Potter, of like
Oh no, yeah.
opening the book. So it's like I'm envisioning this in my head, like Jesus opens the book and the
Hmm.
book tells him, like, it's like writing him a message of like, this is what you're supposed to do. And I immediately thought of like Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And I feel like it's offensive to say that because I'm not trying to equate like God to Voldemort.
No.
But like that's just immediately what I thought of, was like
Okay.
this book of like this like message appearing of like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, we can say God's name, so it's not quite
yeah, here you go.
Voldemort.
But I will say this quote from, well, okay, I am at the point in my King James Bible where I
You getting
believe
red letters?
all of, yes, yeah, and that's what I was
Yes.
about to say. So the red letters, and this is also a point of clarification with you, the red letters are words from Jesus, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. That's because that was kind of the differentiation I was trying to understand, is if these are the words of God or if they're the words of Jesus.
They're specifically the words of Jesus. It's a famous thing. I think it's a King James thing, and it's carried out in other Bibles, but it's a famous thing. I actually am linked with a movement in the Philly area called Red Letter Christians, and
Okay.
the idea is like people will say like what parts of the Bible, like there's so many things in the Bible and things can conflict, like what parts do you take seriously, and it's like the red letters, like what Jesus said. And it's like this whole idea of like being true to what Jesus taught, not, excuse me, not to some other broader narrative. But that's a whole nother thing. But yes, so red letters are cool.
Though that actually that is interesting, and that's
Mm-hmm.
helpful. So I will say, so this chunk of red here,
Yeah,
this is the part when I was like, as soon as I read this, I was like, okay, yeah, I
yeah,
see why
yeah,
Dante did this. But I think it's worth reading out loud because
yes,
I think
please.
it's super powerful.
Yeah,
Um,
please read it. Yeah, this is great.
and I will also say, so actually, maybe I should go to this other book because I liked the wording in this one better.
Yeah, they
Um,
probably use the NRSV in the Palestine book.
do you remember? Do you know what the page is? Oh,
Mine's is digital. I was gonna say mine's is digital, so I don't know.
okay. So the way that they worded it in here, yeah, it's just more direct.
Yeah,
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, and to let oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.
yeah, that's the NRSV. Yep, that's the one. Yeah.
So I definitely like that quote.
Hmm.
Definitely a fan. Can see why you like that.
Yeah.
Um, let me see. So, but the takeaway from the whole story though is that Jesus is understanding more of his intended purpose on the earth, if I'm understanding correctly. And that, I mean, I personally just appreciate this emphasis on the poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear, like why this passage, what are your thoughts?
Mm-hmm.
I read a little bit um from our other book, A Palestinian Theology of Liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts. I will say a little bit later on in the story, also I feel like I'm kind of rambling now too. Um, with really the second part where he starts like I guess the second real chunk of the red letters.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of references that I don't understand, so the second part
Yeah.
didn't really make as much sense to me, if I'm being completely honest.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't understand the references, so I don't understand the points that he's making with that. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I guess, yeah, if you want to give me your thoughts and
Yeah.
or I don't even know the best way to go about that. Your thoughts, maybe why you like this passage, and then we can break down kind of what he's getting at with some of these references in the second part.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with the first part. So we, our past episodes, we had him being baptized and some of the earliest parts of his ministry, and then he goes back to Nazareth. And remember, Nazareth is where Jesus grew up, right? So he's going back to his hometown. Um, and it says it's the Sabbath day, and it was custom to stand up and read. So similar to church where someone would give a reading, people who had authority would stand in the synagogue and they would read from the Hebrew scriptures. The passage that he's reading is a passage from the prophet Isaiah. I don't have the verse off the top of my head. Wait, I think it's in my notes somewhere. Um, he's reading Isaiah. I can't. I don't know. Either way, he's reading a passage from the prophet Isaiah, and that's that passage that you just read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, release the captives, set the prisoners free, so on and so forth. And then he sits back down and he says, "Today, this scripture will be fulfilled in your hearing." So, a couple of things. One, there's a lot of like context here that's really important. So one is just the town of Nazareth itself. Nazareth is like think of it as like a podunk town. Like there's nothing there. Archaeological records show like virtually no roads, no schools. So the fact that he would have gotten up and read anything would be astounding because like chances are anyone from Nazareth would be illiterate. There was an interesting note in my Jewish study Bible that said that it's actually probably unlikely that they had a full scroll of Isaiah. There's, without getting into too much detail, like the scrolls themselves were really big and ornate, and like smaller towns like Nazareth didn't have access to full length scrolls like that. They just wouldn't have been able to house it. And so he may have had like either a smaller excerpt or he may have committed it to memory, or perhaps he's Jesus. He just says it because he knows it, right? Um, but he chooses that piece specifically. And unlike in past weeks, if you notice, I didn't give you anything from Mark or
Yeah.
Matthew. And this story is in Mark and Matthew, but it's like two verses in both of them. And it's just like he went to the synagogue and then they chased him away. But this Luke really goes into detail and really wants us to see how Jesus presents himself. And so earlier you said like, oh, well, it seems like Jesus is like coming to know who he is. I would say it's Jesus proclaiming to everyone else who he is. And this is really important for us today because one of the kind of main arguments that you're going to get from people about Jesus and Christianity and what it means to be a Christian and what the gospel of Jesus is sort of like, where do we find like a definite sort of proclamation of what Jesus came to do? And you can kind of like pull at different things. People in the liberation theology sort of circle, this has been probably one of the most important verses for them because this is where a lot of liberation theology is grounded. This is Jesus proclaiming what he is here to do. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the captives, and in other versions it says prisoners specifically, the recovery of sight to the blind, let the oppressed free, and proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And so if we go through that line by line, bring good news to the poor. Most of the people in this town would have been poor. Jesus himself would have come from low means. They're living under Roman occupation, and which is part of the reason why most of them are poor. They have to pay lots of taxes to Caesar. They have to pay lots to even give certain things to the temple. There's a lot that makes these people in these outskirts poor. So he specifically has come for the impoverished, and that's a political statement in and of itself, because he's saying, like, I'm coming to release people whose poverty is infringed on them by the empire, to proclaim release of the captives, or you see how it starts to tie in, right? To proclaim the release of the captives or release of the prisoners. One of the most common types of prisoners at this time was debtor's prison. And so there were people, and debtor's prison was actually often like set up intentionally to basically lock people up even if they didn't owe or anything like that, because they knew that they really couldn't fight it. Like, he's not just talking about letting people go who owe a debt. He's also talking about like innocent people or people who have just been taken advantage of. Recovery of sight to the blind. You're talking about people in poor health. A lot of times in the Bible, specifically in the Gospels, health conditions like are interchangeable. Like, you see a lot of stuff about leprosy, but like historically, leprosy was not common in this region. And what a lot of scholars go back and say is like it gets translated leprosy, but they're just talking about sickness. So like he's just talking about like helping people get better who are healing people who are sick. And again, sickness is a result of poverty and oppression in and of itself, right? Think people who don't have access to medical care, things like that.
It would be remiss to ignore the reality of what is happening in Palestinian hospitals in Gaza right now.
Yeah,
like
they're targeting hospitals for people who all their other hospitals have already been bombed, right? So
by the oppressor.
Right. So same. So again, super parallel. And then let the oppressed go free. Self-explanatory there. But again, that's a middle finger to Rome and to the empire. And then the last part is really important. Proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So the year of the Lord's favor, or the year of Jubilee, this goes back to Leviticus in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Testament.
I do remember that from Bible school. I do remember that from Sunday school. Leviticus.
Yeah.
That's the bad guy.
Yeah. But this is a good part of Leviticus.
That's the no-no book.
Yeah, that is the book that gives us a lot of like, don't do this, don't do that. But one of the laws listed out in Leviticus was that every 7 years you were supposed to forgive all debts. Well,
interessante.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there were a lot of people who were kind of either were not Jewish and just weren't following that, or maybe were Jewish and were choosing not to follow that. And so he's like, I'm here to proclaim the year of Jubilee. I'm proclaiming that everyone is debt free. And that probably takes a literal and spiritual sort of like tinge to it. So this couple of verses, it's really one verse, gives us a ton to unpack about who Jesus is and what Jesus's mission is. And this is why those of us in the liberation theology sort of bracket always read everything in the gospel and really through the Bible in this light, because we're kind of looking back at this and we're going, if this is what Jesus proclaimed, then like this should be the underlying base message. It shouldn't just be like a little cherry on top. This is the food, right? This is the nourishment. So he says all of that, and then it says he rolls up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Everyone was on him. They kind of spoke well. They were amazed at first, and then something interesting happens in verse 22. They said,
I will say, I did take a note about this part. And this, when I wasn't quite sure if I was interpreting this correctly, or this is, I will take this translation with a grain of salt at all times. But so it says, is this not Joseph's son? And in my notes I was like, this peasant?
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
who does this peasant think he is?
So
Like,
you're on to what most scholars agree is what is happening here. Although it
okay,
would be less like this peasant and more like you're not better than me. Because
okay,
it's not like they're rich and he's poor. They're all poor.
okay,
So they're
okay,
like, wait, you're Joseph's son. You're the
okay,
son of the artisan, right? Not even everyone says carpenter, but like laborer. Like who basically who do you think you are?
like you're no better than us.
Exactly, exactly. And then Jesus says back to them, you will quote me this proverb, you say, doctor, cure yourself. And you'll say, do here in your hometown things that you have done at Capernaum. So he's saying, like, this is what you're going to say to me. You're going to tell me I'm so special, then heal myself, which we're going to come back to that in a second because there's something really interesting there. And also, you're going to tell me to do all the miracles that I've done here. Basically, he's telling them like you guys are going to doubt me, right? And it very much is giving like you saw me grow up, you know who I am, and you don't believe in me because I was that kid that was running around in your neighborhood, and like you can't see past the little kid that grew up in Nazareth. And again, Nazareth is kind of supposed to be like not much of a town.
Quick question, and probably not that important, but kind of curious. So how old is Jesus here in this scenario? Do we
30,
know?
probably 30, 31.
Okay, okay. I would
Mm-hmm.
not have guessed that. I would have guessed like 18.
Yeah,
And
no, this was the start of his ministry. He was 30. So this is at the start of his ministry.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I would not have known that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean and that's an interesting point too. It's like he's a fully matured man at this point.
Because this really is like kind of like right after some of these other stories that we read.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to read like kind of literally
Yeah.
I'm being presented. And at no point does it clearly say, 18 years forward, he's a grown up.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. It
So
gives
like
you
I
when he's
actually, even when I was reading it, I really was imagining him as kind of like not necessarily 12, 13, but I was
but like
imagining him like 18.
yeah, like a young adult. No, he would have been 30, and that's one of the sort of I guess you could even say frustrations in the Jesus story. It's like you get this like 12-year-old at the temple, and then you get the baptism, and he's 30 at the baptism. So it's like that whole chunk in the middle
Okay,
we
I
don't have
totally
any.
even missed that part last week that he was already 30 by then. Totally missed that
Yeah.
jump.
Yeah,
Okay.
so he starts his ministry at 30. So all the most of Jesus's life is 3 years. It's 30 to 33.
And I feel
Yeah.
like I knew that,
Hmm.
but when I was reading it, I didn't think about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
So
so
yeah.
let's get back to this. I will also, I know that I keep saying I'm dedicated to reading this version that is in my family that
Yeah.
I've been given, but every time that you read a quote and I align it to what is said here,
It's so different.
like fuck this. Like why am
Yeah.
I torturing myself with it? And it is the same like I really don't think the meaning is that far off.
No, it's just
But
harder to read.
yeah. And I honestly I feel like one of my 10th graders is just like, why do you make us read these sources?
Yeah.
Um, but so here it says, yeah, ye will surely say unto me this proverb, physician, heal thyself.
Yeah.
Whatsoever we have heard done in Capernaum.
Hmm.
That's one of the references. I don't get the reference.
Yeah.
Um,
So Capernaum's a larger city where he was previous to this. And he did some miracles in Capernaum and then came back to Nazareth. And so the idea is he's saying like you're going to say, "Oh, I heard you did all these great things in Capernaum, do it here." You're going to doubt that I can do the things that everyone is saying I can do.
so did I miss that, or where is that laid out?
I mean, it's not laid out in just these verses. You would have had to have
So is it
connected
like is
previous
it
verses.
I guess like is it earlier in Luke that we missed, or is this in the other gospel.
You have to take them all together, and they're not necessarily in chronological order. So it's something that like you have to like take in with like a lot of study to be like, oh, he was referencing what happened previous to this.
So average Joe just sitting down and reading this is probably not going to be putting that together.
No, probably not. Most likely not.
Okay, where's it? Okay, so blah blah. He said,
Hmm.
"Verily I say." Actually, let me go back to my notes because I had them better worded in here. Um. Oh, actually, this was another, and I assume this is an Old Testament reference, or I assume this is a story in the Old Testament, but genuinely no idea what they're talking about.
Hmm.
Um. Okay. Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country. Well,
Yeah.
that actually, I feel like you probably have a lot to say about that. That is a very
Hmm.
powerful line.
Yeah.
And that was another line that really stuck out to me and I think applies so much to a lot of the history, like I'm talking about in my different history classes, what we were talking about in chapel.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about that particular line before getting into some of my
Yeah.
clearer.
Yeah, that line is really powerful, and that's one that if there's anything you've heard of from this story, that might be it. That no prophet is accepted in his hometown.
Yeah.
You can see he goes on to reference Elijah, Elisha. So these are all Old Testament prophets, and there were times where they weren't accepted by their own people. They were rejected by their own people, and they ended up going out and doing great work among Gentiles, among non-Jews. And so Jesus is, one, he's saying like, he's kind of referencing that thing that I think we all know, which is like you grow up in a town or a neighborhood or whatever, you go off to college, you go off to do something great, you come back and everyone's like, oh, you think you're hot shit, you're no better than any of us, right? There's some of that there. The other thing that's here is the Gentile mission, right? Jesus is specifically in Luke making a statement about doing great things among, all the world, not just among the Jews. And that is, I think it's an important pivot that Luke wants to make. And even if we go back to the Old Testament, like he quotes Isaiah all throughout Isaiah or the prophet Micah, there's all these verses where they say things like, um, and the world will, every knee will bow, and the world will look to Jerusalem on the mountaintop and come, and we will all worship together. Like this idea that when God sort of comes through on this prophecy and reconciles the world, all the world will see God. In a sense, our God, that they will see God for who God is. God will come to the world or reconcile the world through Judaism, in a sense. And so Jesus is kind of referencing that. Like here, Jesus is Jewish. Jesus is an incarnation of, a representation of um, the Jewish God, and he's going out and spreading his message among non-Jews. And so he is very much trying to connect himself to these like messianic prophecies that talk about everyone receiving God in this like more universal way from within Judaism. And that's why he makes those Old Testament references. Like Elijah was sent to none of them except a widow at Zarephath in Sidon, right? So essentially, he's saying Elijah wasn't sent to his home country; he was sent to a widow in another country, a Gentile, right? Same thing with Elisha and the lepers. He wasn't. He was sent to Naaman in Syria.
So one of my first like questions, reactions upon hearing that though is like I'm wondering if this is the scripture, the lines that kind of justify a lot of Christian missionary efforts.
Yes and no.
Throughout world history, I think, and I actually like in one of my classes, this is a topic we talk about extensively, and one of the more advanced classes, not the basic world history, but like the church has caused a lot of harm
Yeah.
throughout history, especially through colonization. I
Right.
think there are also a lot of instances where, not maybe a lot is an overstatement. There have been instances where it has been really helpful, and especially in terms of education.
Right.
But
Right.
but I mean, even even today, there's this whole, I don't know if movement is the right word, but I would say industry of,
Mm-hmm.
like these young
Missionary work,
Christians, like, traveling to Africa and honestly, prominently, like,
doing more harm than good.
yeah, well, I was going to say, like, very Christian African countries that have very strict interpretations of Christianity
Yeah.
that are very, yeah, exactly, like, that are very harmful, and they go, it's like Uganda, honestly, is like what comes to
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
um and I'm wondering if this passage, if the scripture for how you're describing it is partially what justifies those actions, or like
So
those from that perspective.
So really, no. A lot of that is coming from Paul. And we haven't gotten into Paul. Paul is like kind of the rest of the New Testament in a sense.
Okay.
And even that, I'm gonna say even that is a misinterpretation, but still, Paul is very much like he's systemizing Christianity in a lot of ways. And he's saying, I mean, it's inaccurate to say he's systemizing Christianity because he would not have called himself a Christian or called what he was doing Christianity in any way. But the Christ believing Jews, he is like establishing their congregations, and a lot of the rhetoric that people pull from Paul is that like get saved, get born again rhetoric. We have to go out into the nations and tell everyone to believe what we believe. If you pay attention to what Jesus does after he leaves here, and this is why it's interesting to really think about what does it mean to be Christian, or what does it mean to be to accept the gospel. At no point does Jesus go out and say like, say this prayer and believe in me or you go to hell. That never happens. He just goes out and does the work. He goes out and heals people. He goes out and defends the poor. He goes out and eats with the prostitutes. So what I would actually say is missionary work should be modeled after this. Because what Jesus is doing here is he's saying, you're not going to accept me here. I'm going to go out to the world and heal the world and reconcile the world and stand up for the oppressed in the world. There's no requisite. There's no
Like
prerequisite.
conversion.
Yeah, there's no conversion, there's no prerequisite. And if there, I mean, there's plenty of conversion, but what never happens is Jesus going, you better do this or believe this or else. What is instead happening is Jesus heals someone and then they go, oh my God, you are God. And then they come to faith. And so what that suggests to me and to a lot of people in more progressive versions of Christianity is that if people are going to come to Christianity, it's not going to be because we sold them on this theology first and then all of a sudden God comes into their life and does great things. It's going to be because God came into their life and did great things, and they had a moment where it caused them to say, I'm going to worship and connect to this God because I've seen this God work in my life even when I wasn't looking for it. There's a verse that says it is the grace of God that brings a man to forgiveness, right? Like, in other words, people experience God first, and then they decide to, if you want to use the word convert. But we, and like evangelicals specifically, kind of have it backwards, where like they're trying to convert everyone and like telling everyone, oh, you're going to experience all the good stuff after you convert. And like that's not what Jesus is doing. Like, but yeah.
That actually, that's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. Um, I feel like I'm still processing that for a second.
hmm Well, I'll as you process that, I'll just finish up real quick. And
Yeah, go ahead.
the sort of last part of verse 29, it just says they got up, they drove him out of the town, they led him to the bow of the hill on which their town was built, so that they might hurl him off the cliff. But he passed through the midst of them and went on his way. I read a Jewish commentary on this, and it's always funny. It's really, first of all, I say it all the time. Get the Jewish annotated Bible, and read things from the perspective of Jewish scholars, so that it gives way deeper context. They were very blunt in saying like Nazareth was not built on a hill and there was no cliff, like, and so which is important context. So this is obviously like hyperbole or like dramatic sort of like rendition that's added into the story. But something else that I thought was really good and really important, and I'm actually going to see if I can, I'll pull it up here, because I thought this was a really important context that they added. Oh, I just had it open. That they added, and that can be misinterpreted if you don't go and read from a Jewish perspective. Um, so all right, so I'll start from here, and this is a Jewish scholar by the name of Amy Levin. And so she says Christian sermons occasionally explain this murderous reaction by claiming that the Jews, as not only ethnocentric but xenophobic, wanted to reserve the messianic benefit for themselves. So, otherwise, in other words, the Jews in Nazareth were so mad that Jesus wanted to spread. That Jesus was the Messiah and wanted to bring himself and God to the Gentiles, that they tried to kill him because they were ethnocentric and xenophobic. Um, and then she goes on to say, therefore, they seek to kill Jesus because he has a positive message for the Gentiles. Such conclusions misread Jewish history. Jews in general had positive relationships with Gentiles, as witnessed by the court of Gentiles in the Jerusalem temple. Gentiles as patrons of the synagogues, which we see in chapter 7, verses 1 through 10, and Gentiles as God-fearers, which we see in Acts 10. They also expected the redemption of righteous Gentiles. That's what I was just talking about. All the prophecies say that the Gentiles will come to God and be redeemed, who come streaming to Zion, as it says in Zechariah 8:23. In those days, 10 men from nations of every language shall take hold of a Jew, grasping his garment and saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And so then what she ends with is the rejection of Jesus is not prompted by xenophobia, it's prompted instead by Jesus's refusal to provide his hometown with messianic blessings. And so I was able to go to what book? Oh, I think it was in this book, the Palestine in the Time of Jesus. Um, and what they were talking about was that during this time period, something that's important to understand this time period better is that it was understood that like that for someone to be blessed meant that someone else was losing out. Just plugging this in real
All
quick.
right. Zero sum game. I mean, literally, that's something I've been talking to my current U.S. history class. A zero
Right.
sum game. If
Right.
one wins, the other loses.
Right. And so when Jesus says, I'm going to bring this to the Gentiles, the angry response is not, how dare you bring it to those dirty, dirty Gentiles? The angry response is, but what about us? If you give it to them, are we then going to lose it? And so they're upset with Jesus because it seems like he's turning his back on them. They don't have.
Oh, Shay's revolting.
Shay was upset. Um, they don't have a they don't have a negative view of they don't have a negative view of the Gentiles at all. They just don't they just feel that Jesus is turning his back on his community. Right. So this is more highlighting strife between Jesus and his hometown than strife between Jews and Gentiles.
I'm kind of wishing now. So okay, a little bit of story time and throwback. I
Yeah.
did visit Nazareth.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
and I actually really liked Nazareth is a really interesting town. And especially in terms of like more recent Palestinian history, because it
Mm-hmm.
is a more predominantly Christian town
Yeah.
uh, than a lot of other Palestinian towns. And when when you're looking at what happened in 1948, Nazareth was actually supposed to be in the so we have the okay, Amy, focus. I I promise I can explain this. We have the 1947 United Nations partition of the British Mandate of Palestine.
Right.
And in that initial partition of the country, which most people can objectively identify as a really unfair proposition to the Palestinian people to
Mm-hmm.
begin with. Um, Nazareth was in the Palestinian proposed territory.
Mm-hmm.
But this was one of the areas that after the 1948 war, Israel, like it became part of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a lot of contested territories in all of this land from different time periods, but Nazareth is one of the areas that was originally in 1947 designated to be part of the Palestinian state, but after the 1948 war became part of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So most people in Nazareth today are Arab. So this is like
Right.
a huge center of like Arab Israelis, if you will. I just put that in quote marks for anyone who's not watching.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a very Arab town though. Like when you visit Nazareth, it has an Arab vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you're in any place, in any city in these territories, whatever you want to call it, the Holy Land, if you will,
Yeah.
you can tell if you are in an Israeli town or if you're in a Palestinian town. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
vibe. You
Yeah.
got it. But Nazareth has a very strong like Palestinian Arab vibe.
Mm-hmm.
And I went with my mom, and it was a really cool time, really great time. And I can't remember if it was last week or a couple weeks ago, I was ranting and raving about the tourism industry
Mm-hmm.
and specifically the tourism industry around John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
And in Nazareth, there's also a huge tourism component.
Yeah,
And
I would expect so. Yeah.
I did not. Well, me and my mom went to we went to the basilica, and it's I remember I thought it was so clever. It was the tomb where it happened. Uh,
I want to be in the tomb where it
yeah, yeah.
happened.
So like, yeah, we went down to yeah, I thought I was so clever with that reference. Um,
Nice.
but but like where we were staying in town, like they have this whole like it reminded me of like when I was growing up, we had like vacation Bible school.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh where everyone's like put into a tribe, and then you like wear like different robes, and honestly it's probably pretty offensive.
Yeah.
You're in the mountains of Western North Carolina. But it was like a whole village
Hmm.
there where you could like go and experience what it would be like to be living in the times of Jesus. And
Right.
I say I wanted nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
But given our conversation now, and I guess the context that you're giving about Nazareth being such an impoverished area that
Yeah.
wasn't really built up, I am really curious now as to like what that experience would have been,
Hmm. Yeah.
how it's presented
Hmm.
this current tourism industry when they're trying to get people to come, because quite frankly, Donte, I don't think that it's being portrayed as how you are describing it is
No, probably
ultimately where
not.
I'm getting at through that long rant that I just gave.
Yeah. No, and that's actually a problem within the sort of Jesus tourism industry, and there obviously there's a heavy evangelical focus, and for some reason like evangelicals don't like admitting that Jesus was poor, and I think because it has implications on like what we are supposed to do if we worship a poor Palestinian man who was oppressed. And so I've heard people even say like, oh, he owned his about something that's not talked about as much, that you
Okay.
can kind of get from this story, which is what did Jesus look like?
Okay, so how do we get I mean, I think this is a great question, and you were talking about
Mm-hmm.
this in chapel earlier today. But
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
curious about the connection from this story to that message. I
So
would not have gone there.
yeah, so there's nothing super apparent, right? But and I learned this in a class with a really awesome professor, uh, that I really enjoy taking classes with. But we talked a little bit about some of the stuff I was talking about in chapel today, and images of God and Jesus, and painting Jesus white, blonde hair, blue eyed, like all those kinds of things. And we know that he was not that. And so when we think of like, well, what did Jesus actually look like? There is a recorded description from Josephus in one of Josephus's writings about Jesus. Now, it should be noted that um, this it is debated whether this is an authentic Josephus inscription, but it's still very interesting. So, in this inscription from Josephus, it says that Jesus was a man of simple appearance, mature age, dark skin, small in stature, 3 cubits high, hunched back, with a long face, long nose, meeting eyebrows, scanty hair, parting in the middle of his head, after the manner of Nazarites, with an underdeveloped beard. And so,
Wait, where's this from again?
this is an inscription of Josephus, the first century Jewish historian,
Okay, okay.
a contemporary. Yeah. And
Okay.
then even if
As
we
the
go,
primary source here.
yes, yeah, primary source. Um, and even if we go back to just things in the Bible, the in Isaiah it says like the Messiah will be like unsightly or whatever, that people won't want to gaze at him, things like that. And so he describes Jesus as ugly, unsightly, and hunchbacked, right? And short. Um, it's noted that I think if we convert the cubits, that would have made Jesus like 4.5 feet tall. Now that's not that short, considering that the average height at the time was like 5.5 feet of a man. Like a Roman soldier was like 5'5". So they were shorter in general, but it's still a foot shorter than what was even average. So he would have been short. So some historians have pointed out that this may be somewhat accurate because Jesus was a tekton, or a laborer, and laborers often developed hunchbacks because they were carrying stone and brick and things like that. And so it would make sense that he would have developed a hunchback. And so I remember we're talking about this in class, and so the professor is and he's doing this on purpose, right? He's trying to elicit a reaction out of everyone in class, and he's like, Jesus was ugly, he was ugly, blah 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 blah. And so one of the women in the class, an older black woman, and she's like, well, my Jesus ain't ugly. I don't know what you're talking about, but he ain't ugly. That's fine, you saying whatever you're saying, but blah blah blah. Like, she was so offended. And he was like, why are you offended? He was like, why do we paint pictures of Jesus as handsome and muscular and this, that, and the third? And he goes on to talk about like the idea of idolatry, and the idea that like we want Jesus to look a certain way, whether it's slave masters painting Jesus as white, or us painting Jesus as handsome, or people painting Jesus with guns in his hand and an American flag behind him. We try to make him out, we try to turn him into an idol, like into the things that we worship. And so, in a lot of ways, it almost makes sense that Jesus would be everything we wouldn't worship, because then that forces us to only worship the the spirit and the ideals. You can't worship the looks. You can't worship the stature or anything like that. How this relates to this verse is that he says that the people of Nazareth will say to him, "Doctor, cure yourself." To which the professor looked at us and said, "Cure yourself of what?" And so his argument was that the reason that the people in the town would say, "Doctor, cure yourself," and doubt that Jesus was actually who he said he was, is that he had this very obvious hunchback, or deformity or whatever. And they're saying, if you're this Messiah and you have this power, then cure yourself of this terrible hunchback that you have.
That is interesting.
Yeah. So it's a really, really it was a very fascinating conversation in that class that I took. Um, it really, and it's funny because uh, growing up, and so you grew up Episcopal, right? But
Yeah,
you went to some Baptist churches at times.
no, my
Oh,
father,
never.
no, God, no. My father grew up very Baptist,
Yeah,
and sometimes that influence would come through in shit he said.
right.
But he distanced himself from the Baptist church at all costs. He did not
Yeah.
associate with it.
So something that you'll notice
He
if
did
you
not.
ever,
But
if you ever,
his family, I get it because that's how his family interacted.
right. So if you ever are in a Baptist church or even like an AME church or whatever, like some of the newer congregational churches, you'll notice that they either one don't have stained glass windows, or two, their stained glass windows don't have images. They might have like a dove or writing or whatever. They do not have images of Christ. Or of anyone in the Bible, whereas Episcopal, Catholic, even Lutheran churches will have these ornate stained glass windows. And what people will what essentially happened is this sort of low church tradition, and actually there's a low church Episcopal tradition too. So some low Episcopal churches don't have those stained glass windows, but they they became to believe that if we draw images of Christ, we will worship the image and not Christ himself. And until 2 years ago or whenever I took this class, I kind of thought that was bullshit. Like I was kind of like, I know like it's just a picture. We're just recreating what we see. Like it doesn't matter. Like no one's worshiping the image. And it was that conversation in class with the professor saying Jesus was ugly and seeing people have a visceral reaction to that when I realized we really do worship the image. We worship the vanity. We want Jesus to be handsome. We want him to be muscular. We want him to be strong and tall, and all of these beauty standards that we value. No different than slave masters making Jesus white and blue eyed, right? It's trying to create Jesus in our image. And it led me to believe, one, we really shouldn't adorn everything with a bunch of images. We should be forced to worship Jesus for the actual teachings and ideals, not because we're in love with any particular image. And so that was one thing that I came with, and two, I came away with a deep conviction that like to me it actually made more sense that God would, if God is going to be incarnate in someone, that person would be unsightly. I mean, it matches everything else in the story. He's poor. He's lower class. He's among the prostitutes and among, all these like untouchable people. Why not also be hunchback and deformed and have, essentially a disability and be someone that people don't want to look at and all these things? I mean, that like Christ is supposed to embody everything that society rejects. So it makes sense that it would go that deep. So I thought that was an interesting connection, and I always thought that was something I never read that verse that way until that professor. Shout out to Dr. Howard. Until that professor uh, put it that way.
I have a question for you, kind of based on what you were just saying, and also based on what you were talking about in chapel today.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, for those who were not present, which is everyone,
Yeah.
probably. Um, but representation was a huge part of what you were talking about in chapel
Right.
today. And one of my thoughts, actually, where I'm going with this, and thank you, Donte, for some of your programming with Black History Month this month. But I watched for the first time this movie Red Tails.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so have you watched it?
yeah, yeah,
So one of the things that I'm thinking of when you're describing this, of how we like to see Jesus in our own image.
yeah,
And I do think, like, one of the things I'm hearing from you is that I think that this can be we can it's easy for any group of people to make Jesus in their own image.
yeah, yeah.
and it can be harmful, it can be helpful, but
Right.
like
Right.
even when you were describing that though, like the one of the first things that that came to my mind when you were describing this, and how, and granted, I fully agree that having images of Jesus as like a white, blonde, blue-eyed, muscular dude, like it's just
Yeah.
like e- even before I heard this phrase that you were saying,
Yeah.
and I want you to send me that again, or I feel like we need, point of action, and maybe this can be my point of action is, following up on social media of some of these things we're
Like
referring.
readings and stuff. Yeah.
Um, but I would like to read that one that you referenced again about his appearance. But like in this movie that we were watching at school, um, this was like a whole motif throughout the movie, was that like one of these pilots had like black Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And granted, like, like I don't think Jesus was blonde hair and blue eyed. I also don't think he was like as black and muscular and beautiful
No, it
as
wasn't.
this woman had him, or not. Wasn't a woman, it was a soldier,
Yeah.
but like in the movie. But like, I guess I'm curious to hear your views and interpretations of like that, because I see that, I personally see that both as representation,
Yes.
and I can see that as a powerful symbol, but also like, like I guess my question is, like at what point, like is maybe represent like where is representation
Yeah.
important, where is accuracy important, how do we balance this? Because I personally loved seeing this, in this movie of like, these World War II pilots, like, black Jesus is going to take me through, and they always referred to him as black
Black
Jesus,
Jesus. Yeah.
and like and like gave him a kiss, and went off
Mhm.
onto these insane missions. So I guess
Yeah.
I'm curious about your thoughts and reflections about that.
So this is a great question, and the answer is incredibly nuanced. So um, the so if we think of what Jesus literally looked like, you think of whatever a Palestinian man looked like in the first century. Probably brown skin. There are some descriptions. There is a description in the Bible. It says his skin is bronze, woolly hair, things like that. So I mean, you think of like a Middle Eastern person, and that's kind of like generally what we think of. So if we're talking about an accurate description of Jesus, that's what Jesus looks like.
Mhm.
Then we go to white Jesus. And
Mhm.
white Jesus is created not necessarily with the intention of representation, but with the intention of oppression. Um, at least I should specify like Western white Jesus. So the British, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, as their imperialism comes, and as they take over, whether it's Western, parts of Africa, the Caribbean, whatever, they are intentionally painting Jesus in very European ways in order to push an agenda that Jesus looks like us and we are superior, push a God complex.
Mhm.
Black Jesus, conversely, is painted and depicted as a protest to white Jesus.
Mhm.
So it's going to sound to some people hypocritical to say I don't have a problem with black Jesus as much as I have a problem with white Jesus, because they're going to say, well, if one is wrong, isn't the other? But
Compared the intention.
right, it's all about the intention behind it.
Mhm.
The reason that it's kind of like, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter, and why one is, you know, problematic and one isn't. It's that the people painting Black Jesus are painting Black Jesus as a symbol of liberation and protest,
Mhm.
and they're protesting this idea that um, that that Jesus has to be white and that white is superior. They're saying, no, Jesus can look like me too. We're all made in God's image. And by the way, there's also Chinese Jesuses and all, there's all kinds of, every culture paints Jesus in their image. And I do think, and again, incredibly nuanced. And I realize for some people, this is going to sound like if you want to use the term reverse racism or whatever, when I say this, but like, I don't think it's as problematic for these, like, for other cultures to paint Jesus in their image, because they're often doing it to reject this westernized version of Jesus. Now, here's the second piece of nuance, is that there are people who will legitimately argue that Jesus was black. I'm thinking like Hebrew Israelites, if you're familiar with the black Hebrew Israelites.
I actually am.
I thought you might be, yeah. So there are people who take that too far, right? And so now you have people who are claiming that Jesus and God and everyone is black, and they're doing exactly what the Europeans were doing. They're saying that, well, white people are actually the devil and they're actually inferior, and actually God is black, and if we would just separate ourselves from the white devil, God would redeem us. And so I do have a problem again with the intention becomes painting Jesus as black to say that there's some sort of black superiority. I don't like that. But it's important to point out the nuance that most of the people painting Jesus as black are not doing it to say that blacks are superior. They're doing it to say that God is a liberator. We're all made in God's image, and you're not superior to me because of your white skin. As a matter of fact, I will paint Jesus with black skin. I will paint the Virgin Mary with black skin, right? There's black Madonnas and all kinds of things. So there's a really rich history of black Jesus. And I would say, if you're going to have, I tell my wife all the time, she grew up Roman Catholic, all the Jesuses in her mother's house are like blonde hair and blue eyed. And I tell her all the time, when we put anything that's Jesus, and it'll take too long for me to walk around and grab some of the things that we have, but like all of the Jesuses in our house are like brown skin.
Mhm.
And and to me, it's important. Even like when we get nativity scenes, like I'm like, I want either black or brown skin nativity scenes, right? Like I want to, but the artists that make these are doing them on purpose. The other thing too, when we talk about imagery, is I like when we reinterpret Jesus in very specific ways. So I know I showed it in chapel years ago, and I think we talked about it earlier, but there's that artist that painted that picture of Mary, Jesus, and or it's Mary and Joseph, but it's Maria and Jose, and they're like modern, and she's a teenager, and the whole thing. So like they're like a young Hispanic couple, but it's a very intentional message. There's also the Jesus Christ refugee family, where it shows Jesus Christ. It shows Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, but they're on the other side of a fence, right? And they're
There are a
refugees.
lot of Palestinian artists that portray the exact same thing within the
Right.
exact current context of Bethlehem today.
Right. There's even there was a great lecture by a good friend of mine called Pulling Jesus from the Rubble. And he was talking about Jesus. If Jesus was born today in Bethlehem, this was like literally this past Christmas. He was like, if Jesus was born today in Bethlehem, he would have been born in the rubble of the destruction. So those kinds of images are, because they're not painted to oppress another group, they're painted to uplift a minority group or an oppressed group. That, to me, that's very much in the tradition of Jesus, of this verse, right? I came to free the oppressed, to bring
Like,
to bring freedom to the poor. So that is fine. I think that's great. I just think whenever, if you're painting Jesus with the intention um of using it as an oppressive symbol, is when it becomes bad. And that was actually why, if you notice, when I gave the definition, I was like Europeans, or I said white Jesus, and then I stopped and I said specifically Western European, because there are people in Czechoslovakia and parts of Eastern Europe that are painting Jesus white, but they're painting Jesus as a Slav, right? Or something like that, where it's not this oppressive group, or even Italians painting Jesus in like these very Italian scenes, right? Like, so it's like it's again incredibly nuanced. It's not that white Jesus is always bad and black Jesus is always good. It's that if you're going to paint an image of Christ, you should paint it with intentions of showing Christ as liberatory, not as oppressive.
and that that brings me, or like, I think maybe a good note to end on, and also something I want to put I need to get onto our Instagram, Donte. I need to figure out how to get on there.
I got you.
But one of the things in Nazareth that's actually really cool. So there is a basilica. I was showing the tomb where it happened, but there
Yeah.
is a basilica on top of it. And one thing that's really cool about this, I guess church is the right word,
Hmm.
is that they have paintings and like these giant, I wouldn't call them murals because they don't take up walls, but like giant paintings from basically every country around the world has donated or like has made
Yeah.
a painting that depicts the Madonna.
Oh,
Um,
that's awesome.
but it's all from their own different perspectives.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
actually see a lot of this different representation in the way that you're describing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, basically showing how this story resonates within their own communities, but it's literally all over the world. Every country has their own interpretation. It incorporates all different styles, and um, yeah, I need to get on the Instagram, and I'll try to. I one of my goals is to start posting some more on there. Can start
Yeah.
sharing some of my perspective too. But I think I would love to share some of the pictures that I even took of a lot of those paintings in Nazareth of all of these different views of representation from around the world.
Hmm. Nice. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, so this is a, to
I was not expecting you to go this direction.
yeah, yeah. When I read it, I was like, oh, this will be a fun little kind of tangent to bring it up on. But ultimately, I think the thing to pull from this verse is that that little freedom song. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. To me, that's gospel, and that's what it's supposed to be about, and that's what the Jesus movement is supposed to be about. And so, I think this is an incredibly deep and rich text for that, and I think it's a good text to sort of ground yourself in what all this means and kind of read everything through the lens of that. So I encourage everyone to read Luke, and specifically Luke 4:16 through 30, and continue to look for liberation in your life and in the world, in Palestine, in Congo, and in all the places that where liberation is needed. But as always, you can follow us at bourbon_Bible_stories on Instagram. And we're on Spotify. Thank you guys for dealing with our little technical difficulties last week. We had no visuals, but we were just on Spotify. We should have visuals this week.
Props to Jonte for the technical work.
Yeah.
All the props to Jonte for handling all these problems. He's got it under control.
I'm trying.
But yeah, questions, comments, we love hearing them. I love hearing from, friends and family that are listening to it. Let us know what you think. Anything you want to talk about, hear us talk about. I think we're both enjoying doing this weekly.
Yeah.
And yeah, have a wonderful week, amigos.
All right. Have a good one, guys.
All right, ciao ciao. Buenas noches.
See you.